Hello, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rob Mason and I'm the Director of Regulatory Intelligence at Global Relay. What a webinar we have in store for you today. We have a fascinating and very topical subject to unpick with a pair of real industry luminaries to provide their experience and expertise. So let me start by introducing them. On my left is Hamad Hanif, Head of Electronic and Voice Surveillance and QA at Lloyds Banking Group. And I can speak from my own time working alongside that Hamad is a highly experienced banking professional who's built on his roles in sales and trading to become an expert in the risk and surveillance fields. During his tenure at Lloyds, Hamad has been instrumental in developing the strategies, plans, systems and controls for benchmark monitoring and surveillance there. Developing and inspiring large teams and working with various departments to create effective monitoring systems and processes has been a key feature of his career journey. Hamad chaired the GIMLIT working group on AML trade surveillance and post-FCA thematic review and continues to work on emerging themes and risks in surveillance. Welcome.
Thank you.
On my right is Darren Sir. So Darren's the Global Head of Surveillance, Bony Melon Markets in the First Line. Darren's been running the Global First Line of Defence Surveillance and Supervision team at Bony since 2019. Before joining, Darren worked at the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, the UK's premier conduct regulator, as a technical specialist in the market surveillance team, leveraging his extensive trading knowledge and experience to help to detect market abuse in financial markets through the creation of in-house alerts. I can vouch for the fact that this is an extremely challenging role. Darren has also co-authored several publications, hosted forums for UK-based banks, and represented the FCA at international conferences. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Rob.
So today's session is called Social Media Risks, to Ban or Not to Ban. Like it or loathe it, social media is now mainstream communications channels with the capability to post to an extremely wide audience. It can advertise products and services, as well as being a bilateral or group communications medium. On top of that, there are of course multiple social media platforms with billions of people connected to them. This clearly presents compliance risks in numerous areas, but narrowing this down to a securities regulation communications perspective, there are a number of key risks that need to be navigated through. Here at Global Relay, we've undertaken a couple of industry surveys, and one in particular focused on just the social media channel, which is LinkedIn. We asked 10,000 firms if they keep records and supervise LinkedIn, and 33% said yes. This stat alone demonstrates that there are polarised views regarding how we treat social media, and the immediate thoughts are, should we cover it all? Should we just keep records? Should we supervise and monitor all in-scope employees? Should we cover everyone, or should just this be limited to firm social media? Big questions, and I'd like to start by getting initial thoughts from you both at a high level. Hamad, would you like to give us yours?
Sure. Thank you, Rob, firstly for the lovely introduction, and to Global Relay for the opportunity to participate in an interesting topic such as this. I think, like you said in your intro, social media is here, it's in the mainstream, and it's going to continue to evolve. I think the key is we need to make sure that it provides the right benefits whilst making sure it doesn't cause more harm than good. In the financial services industry, it's an enormous tool for marketing and promotions, and firms can do that in two ways, whether that's through organizational accounts set up, such as LinkedIn, where they promote and post their products to customers, or through the use of employees' personal accounts, whereby employees potentially could like posts, forward promotional material on. And all this does is this actually raises the challenge around retentions, record retentions. Firms need to record that information to protect themselves. Now, if you're using it as a marketing tool, then 100% it's a requirement to record all of that data. The challenge becomes when you are monitoring personal social media. You know, what are the regulations around that? Because you then are, in essence, taking into account data protection, privacy laws, etc. In addition to that, there's whole medium of different avenues where communications can still take place that are probably not technically social media, but you have the likes of Reddit, you have the GameStop issue, you've got the dark web, you've got Telegram, etc. And I think all of these are also mediums which I think firms do need to focus on in the future. Now, I'm not going to delve in too much into the details. I'm sure we'll start unpicking all of these further down in the session.
Thank you. Darren?
Thank you, Rob. Thanks also to Global Relay for the opportunity to be here. First off, sorry, I've got to give a couple of disclaimers. So the views expressed within the material are obviously mine and not those of BMY, and the material doesn't constitute a recommendation by BMY of any kind. The information herein is not intended to provide any tax, legal, investment advice, etc. And obviously BMY has not independently verified the information contained in the material and makes no representation as to the accuracy. BMY assumes no direct and consequential liability for any errors that I make or reliance of any kind. Thank you for the introduction as well. Appreciate that. I mean, I largely agree, obviously, not even largely, I agree completely with what Hamid said, actually, and he made some really good points. I think we'll delve into to some of the questions, but, you know, high off, you know, this remains a very hot topic. Most firms are sort of either had or receiving fines, we know that, so it's definitely top of mind and being talked about at very high level management meetings. Whether it's a debate about record keeping, given the content, could well be business related. So we know that. But also, for me, really, it brings into question the sort of non-financial risks, which are becoming more and more of a hot topic, as I think we all know. The conduct of staff, both inside and outside the organisation, is paramount. Obviously, what people say outside of the workplace is actually a reflection on the employer. And this is not a new thing. And I think, you know, we've seen sort of historic issues where, for example, somebody evading a train fare could actually sort of have an implication for the firm and then ultimately that person's career. So, yeah, I think it's a great topic, and I think we'll get into some good points.
That's great, thank you. So I think moving on, besides the obvious risks presented by the trend of emerging social media and off-channel comms, what issues are firms likely to miss and not see with regards to social platforms which may cause concern from a regulatory perspective? Darren, would you like to lead us off there?
Yeah, and I think, Hamad, you sort of touched upon it in your opening remarks, actually. For me, I think the risk is how people are behaving on their social platforms. How, you know, they will have a link to the workplace and the employer, and they could be seen in that light. So, you know, how could posting comment on a personal account tip into business content? Should it be recorded? Is it business content? And therefore, you know, the recording requirements kind of kick in. Recognising personal handles. So, you know, how do you explain to your employer and what is the process around giving your employer the details of your personal social accounts? And then, as I say, distinguishing that behaviour versus the messages coming out on the corporate accounts as well. Social media increasingly sees the use of sort of emojis, and I think explaining the content or the sort of the meaning behind that content is really key, especially when you're performing e-com surveillance, for example. I think obviously we've touched on record keeping angle, platforms that allow sort of ephemeral messages, you know, making sure that stays from a record retention perspective is really important. And we know that, you know, some regulators, especially in APAC, are starting to use social media as a method of communicating with firms now. So it's really important, you know, who has access to the firm's social account and interacts with sort of regulatory bodies as well.
Even the regulator using it.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that in APAC.
Hamad?
Yeah, so yeah, Darren's made some very interesting points. I think just a few in addition. So another way of looking at social media is I think there's a risk that people could be using, or colleagues could be using, social media to base trading decisions on, which may potentially be illegal activity. So an example would be you could get fake news coming on all the social media channels with the intention to drive the stock price of company X down. and you have a trader or someone sitting there looking at social media and say, oh, this is happening. You can see the stock price going down, and then they undertake a trade that is reflective of that news that they're hearing. Now, this to me is a risk, because ultimately that employee could be participating in a wider illegal activity. They're not privy to, obviously, the fact that it's fake news. They are reacting to what is happening in the news and on the stock price. So that is a big risk, I think, that firms face as social media continues to become more mainstream. I think, like Darren said quite rightly, the challenges are, how do you surveillance, to what level of surveillance you do that? From a non-personal perspective, should firms be monitoring social media as a news feed or a Bloomberg feed like firms do? And also regarding personal information or personal social media handles, should they be actually monitoring that for employees? And the challenge then becomes, if some of these are set to privacy, how does employees and firms get comfortable with that relationship? Emojis, again, like Darren has said, I think the challenge there is it's interpreting what those emojis are, right? And it's very easy for us to put our thumbs up or smiley face, but what does that mean? And how can you prove wrongdoing or malintent from it? And I think that's probably the next challenge that's going to be faced with firms if things are found in emojis and GIFs as well. With regards to employee content, I think employees definitely need to buy into this. Without that, it doesn't work. So there needs to be clear stances by the organizations or firms, and the employees of those firms need to understand what the requirements are. And just lastly, endorsements and disclosures, right? So within social media, we've seen loads of endorsements, etc., which we're going to touch upon later, so I'm not going to kind of give it away here, but there is a requirement from the Financial Trading Commission in the US and the UK's Competitions Market Advisory that disclosures and endorsements need to be upfront with every promotion. And if it's not, then it's deemed hidden activity, which is illegal, or hidden advertising, which is illegal. So the regulators are aware of this space, and it's there to basically promote information asymmetry and allow customers or investors to make an informed decision as part of their decision-making process.
I think just digging into that, sort of the approaches and something which came out of our 2024 Industry Insights report suggested that there were sort of 5 different approaches that firms were taking when combating the risk of social media. And we've talked a lot around sort of treating it as marketing or advertising risk, and whether social media falls under the category of record keeping, the implementation of policies to mitigate risks, and even a complete ban. The questions that strikes as, could social media, or an example of that being LinkedIn, become an approved channel for business comms? Darren, do you have any thoughts on these approaches? Is there one way of being more effective than another?
Well, I think LinkedIn is already becoming an approved channel, really. It's, certainly many firms now have corporate accounts and corporate handles for certain individuals. I guess the trick is, from a firm's perspective, is making sure that for those people outside that perimeter that could be using it, how are they using it, and do they need to ingest it? So I think LinkedIn's a bit of an obvious one, and I think most firms are looking at ingesting sort of personal messages now, or even certainly thinking about it. Maybe they're not doing it yet. It's certainly, as we talked about, a marketing and promotional tool, and I think the disclosure regimes around marketing and promotion, as Hamad rightly mentioned, actually, even here in EMEA as well, are really important to be considering. Certainly, we've talked about financial misconduct, so definitely the conduct aspect is really important. So certainly I'd be considering running those types of messages through those marketing and conduct lexicons, comms, surveillance tools. I think the risk is outside of LinkedIn as well. So what other platforms do we need to consider? And I think that's potentially where the next sort of risks lie. LinkedIn is probably for the older generation now, and I think certainly more younger folk are probably on platforms we've never even heard of yet, Rob. And I think that's where the risk lies as well. So, because obviously they're representing the firm. So,
I think, given that statistic that I quoted at the top, our next industry insights report may suggest an even larger percentage than 33% that are keeping records for LinkedIn. Hamad, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sorry. I think from my view, labelling it as marketing and advertising risk, I think probably doesn't do it enough justice to demonstrate the risk now. And I think regulators are probably expecting a bit more. And I think the issues around record retention or records management also isn't as clear, because I think it depends on jurisdictions as well. Do you capture every communication that potentially may be deemed transactional, or so there's different jurisdictions have different kind of understandings or requirements based on what those are. So I think that's also a challenge and will be a challenge for firms. Like Darren quite rightly said, I think LinkedIn is definitely the acclaimed business channel now, and I think Darren's also correct in that. I think there are other channels as well that I mentioned earlier that are potentially kind of that risk transfer may be happening on those as well. You mentioned it in your intro. Is it a complete ban or not? And I'm probably answering this a bit late, but I think that's a no, because I think it's unrealistic to be able to say, look, we're going to ban social media, and also not to monitor it, because I think you also end up by saying, you're not going to monitor it and you're going to ban it. You almost open up an avenue of a potential kind of channel or medium there. So I think it needs to work both ways, and I think firms need to have a pragmatic approach to this, and they need to be very clear and concise on what their requirements are, what the controls are, and basically work with employees to get comfortable that they're mitigating their risk as a firm.
Thanks for that. Let's change gears a bit and talk about the role of finfluencers. And we've seen some regulatory actions here with social media, another route for advertising. Finfluencers have dominated the compliance news cycle, coming under fire for recent FCA violations. There was a Love Island participants that seemed to be under prosecution. I think one of the Kardashians featured in a crypto scandal. I guess this opens up social media conversation to the marketing rule issue. Hamad, what are your thoughts on those sort of types of cases, those finfluencer cases? Will the regulator provide more clarity as we go along? Are we likely to see more finfluencer fines? Say that easily. That social media rise, it seems, as you mentioned, to be inevitable. So certainly we're likely to have more exposure to that risk.
No, absolutely. So as way of background, the Kim Kardashian pump and dump scandal, as they call it in the press. So Kim Kardashian has 330 million followers apparently on Instagram, 75 million on X. So it reaches a whole broad range spectrum. Basically, she published an Instagram post back in June 21 for a company called Ethereum Max, and she was promoting the Ethereum Max tokens, which is a crypto type currency. And within that post, she embedded a link which basically allowed potential investors to go in instructions on how to buy this token, etc. And she was paid $250,000 for that promotion or post. In 2022, she was fined 1.26 million by the SEC for not disclosing that she had received $250,000 for that post. And the interesting fact is, since the post to the fine, to the date of the fine, that Emax token had declined by 98%. So the question is, if she had disclosed that, would that have stopped or prevented investors or customers or followers from buying and losing almost all of that money? And I think the answer to that potentially is no, right? And I'll touch upon that point later. But one can argue that, okay, fine, crypto is technically a less regulated or unregulated market. But having said that, like you mentioned, the Love Island celebrities have also found themselves afoul of breaking the law, where they've alleged at the moment to have basically been paid by two unauthorized and unregulated individuals to promote basically high risk investment CFD strategies. And they posted that to their 4.5 million followers, so not as big as Kim, but nonetheless. And this was over a period of 3 years. So I think this just shows that it's not isolated to just unregulated. This is also coming into some of the high risk investment products which are more regulated, or you expect to be more regulated. And I think what's prominent and what's driving this is actually there's almost a distortion of a general public view between social media and influencers. And I feel that when influencers or finfluencers are involved, there's almost a disregard of some of the basic things that you would take on board when you're making a decision such as this. So the question is, how do we solve this Kim Kardashian problem? Will this be solved? And I think the regulator is trying to address that. And I think the regulator has been quite clear and setting guidelines, for advertising and at high risk. I think it comes down to a level of public understanding as well. And I think the public need to stop believing in what influencers or finfluencers say and take on board things like endorsements and the payments that they're receiving as part of their decision-making process. Even the FCA, Consumer Duty Act sets up very high standards for advertising, especially within the social media space. So I think the regulation is there. It's just how it's embedded and how it's monitored. I think for me also is, I think the firms that are paying these finfluencers and influencers need to be hit hard, because ultimately, if you think about it, the finfluencers don't have any regulatory responsibility to their followers. They're not even customers; they're followers, right? Whereas, their role is to bring those potential customers or their followers to the door, and then it's up for the organizations to undertake the necessary due diligence to make sure that those potential customers meet their kind of requirements for the product and from a risk perspective. So I think, it's a very hot topic, and I think we potentially will be seeing a lot more activity in terms of fines and enforcements on this.
It's interesting you say sort of there's no responsibility. 330 million people follow what you say and do on a social media channel. I think there has to be some association to that responsibility. I know that I take my responsibility very seriously with my 33 followers.
33 followers. I was going to ask Hamad if he's a follower of Kim Kardashian.
Unfortunately not.
She didn't influence me.
Any thoughts on the finfluencer conversation?
Yeah, I think it's obviously it's really interesting. That was a great response from Hamad actually, and certainly now we're seeing responses from regulators. I mean, when you do a search, you can see even the New Zealand authority, warning investors about the potential risks that are associated with these sort of crypto schemes. I think we're moving now into a pretty scary age where you could actually see hoaxes of people potentially, allegedly, promoting a scheme and then finding out later down the line that it's a hoax. But the damage is probably done. And as you said, would people even bother or not whether it was a hoax? They'd probably still try and get on the next gravy train. And certainly, we've seen sort of breakfast time celebrities on telly endorsing crypto bots and saying how wonderful it is, and I'm now driving a Ferrari after 2 weeks. And I think we all know that's not really probably how it works, is it? So there are some risks. One thing I thought was a bit different actually is probably just highlight that the EU now have released this AI Act, and I thought it's quite interesting because it does look like a bit of forefront legislation to try and get ahead of some of the risks, and certainly they've called out some interesting aspects. So I will read a couple of notes that I made actually. So The specific characteristics of certain AI systems may create new risks related to user safety, which also includes physical safety and fundamental rights. Some powerful AI models that are being widely used could pose systematic risk. And that's really important because the EU wants to promote use of AI, but in a safe way. And obviously firms do as well. It has to be done safely. And these rules now apply to anybody using AI systems within the EU. And I think what it does quite cleverly is try to create some sort of risk categories and a uniform sort of framework around the use of AI. Certainly the FCA are probably, taking this finfluencer case. I think that's quite positive. But yeah, I think, the possible need for a regulatory framework is really important.
Okay, let's change gears again and talk a bit about market risk and monitoring market moving to regulated securities. We saw instances which have affected the prices of trading those underlying regulated securities. The Silicon Valley Bank demise was exacerbated by the news spreading fast, so there's a market risk element there. We talked a bit about the Kardashians swaying market value. Elon loves a post to disclose that is inevitably going to move the market, bearing in mind that he owns the stock often as not that he's talking about. And that spread of fake news, there's the sort of Pentagon and fire, and even if it's a very short-lived price movement, it's still long enough to take advantage of. I guess the question is, with regards to potentially fake news or even AI-generated content creation, what are the regulatory and legal risks when firms seek to market or react to what may be AI-generated content? Any thoughts, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a huge amount of risk to firms, and I think, from a regulatory perspective, as I mentioned earlier, APAC regulators may be a bit further ahead, I'm not sure, but certainly whilst I was at the FCA, I noted that certainly one of the APAC regulators was now monitoring social media channels. They were looking at tweets and posts across some of these well-known sites, Reddit, etc., looking for the drivers of stock price moves as part of their market monitoring. So certainly very keen on how and what's driving sort of stock price moves. The FCA takes a forward-looking approach. As we know, they're very pro-innovation. And even if I think about in EMEA 2016, where the AMF took a case against Bloomberg for actually posting up what turned out to be fake news about the stock Vinci. The Bloomberg analysts allegedly didn't do enough to validate the news story that was sent in. The story was published and the stock plummeted by, I think, maybe even 20% or something before recovering very quickly once the story was redacted. So it's really important that there's a framework and there's monitoring around this. The risks, obviously, that I think come from dissemination of potential inside information. So if firms are using AI within their environment, their ecosystems, and the population that is using them is sort of monitored from a sort of private perspective, could the use of the AI essentially or effectively give away inside information because people might not be using it in a very safe manner? So I think that poses definitely a risk. Obviously, firms that lose money on the back of a hoax being published to the market, that obviously poses a sort of a risk of restitution perhaps, or legal risk. Certainly a lot of firms, I think, are struggling now in terms of what parts of the business should actually be allowed to use AI, and sort of Copilot being an obvious example. Sales and trading, can they be allowed to use it? People on the private side, you'd have thought possibly should be stronger guardrails around usage, for example. So there is certainly a lot of risks out there, and it's definitely a topical subject for everyone.
I think that the validation which news agencies are going to require to have, and in that case, that Bloomberg case is fascinating. I hadn't seen that actually before you mentioned it. But for them to need to validate the stories that they publish because they have the potential to move the market is kind of a precedent, I think, probably. I can't think of another occasion, certainly. Ahmed, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so no, 100% agree with Darren's response to that question. from a perspective of monitoring risk via social media, 100%, I think, firms do need to monitor that. And like I said, I see it now as no different to Bloomberg or Reuters or a newsfeed. The challenge you still get is, how do you determine what's genuine and what's fake? And that will always be a challenge and a risk to some extent for firms. I think timing is also an issue because even if you are monitoring something, you're too late by the time it's happened, right? So how do you overcome that? Like you said, a tweet from Elon could go viral within seconds and move the market, and you would not have picked it up. But it kind of leads me on to my next point, which is around bank controls, right? Which is why we're so heavily reliant on banks' internal controls, where you can pick up unusual activity or price moves. And I think our internal controls as an industry has grown pretty sophisticated, where we can identify and look to pick up market moves from different behaviors. So I think it's less of a risk at this stage, but I think it's something that will get more headlines as we start to progress and use social media more.
Okay, I mean, I guess as part of mitigating that risk is ensuring your employees are following the rules, making sure that they have been clearly communicated, clearly understood, defending against that employee privacy issue. What must firms do to ensure they get employee buy-in, and how can they balance record keeping and monitoring with that privacy? Hamad, do you want to kick us off on that? I think that's a real challenging sort of overview.
Yeah, sure. So I think overall, there is a general understanding that regulated persons do have their activities, their trading activity and their communications monitored. So I think it's not something that's new. I think the challenge around the buy-in comes is when you bring in, kind of the personal social media element into it. And obviously that's there for firms to protect themselves and to monitor other risks. And how do you overcome that? I think firms need to be very clear on what their expectations are. Does it include personal social media or not? And I think employees also need to understand that and the risk that it poses. Yes, monitoring personal social media handles will protect the firm, but it comes at a cost. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration. If let's say firms are monitoring employee communications or personal social media communications, then where does it stop? Is it only monitoring business related, or does that include personal? And what if the personal views are somewhat different to the values and behaviors or cultures of the organization? What if it's a political view and it's not in line with it? So you can see it opens up a whole myriad of kind of challenges for firms. So I think all those things are what causes those challenges to be addressed. And like you kind of mentioned, I think policies, procedures, attestations, training, etc. These are all the key foundations that you need to set the expectations for employees on how to behave and what is expected. And I think this will help firms navigate through some of these challenges in the future.
Just picking up on one thing you said there in the case that you mentioned to me earlier today, that there was an individual who was someone who was associated with The Big Short, whose views were portrayed on social media and were viewed by their employer as being inappropriate to what they believed in. And I'm keen not to get into the political debate around that, but that became almost a precedent. Just like that, is like someone's expressed a view on social media that they hold, but the employer has either taken exception to it by monitoring or had their attention drawn to it, and that's resulted in some disciplinary. So it's exactly to your point.
Exactly, and this is it, and we'll see more of this, right, as people embrace things, as things happen in the world, where social media is now that engine and that mechanism. So it needs to be protected and it needs to be guarded to ensure no one falls afoul of it. Correct.
Yeah, thanks for that. Darren, so yeah, we're talking about the way that we can ensure that employees are following the rules. Have you got some views there?
Well, Hamad's made some great points there, actually, really sort of covered everything. But I think we've had a bit of a precedent with the record keeping fines. So, personal phones, handing over personal phones, and that has become quite a big thing in the last couple of years with the WhatsApp fines. So now, a lot of employers are looking at the contracts that they have with their staff in terms of what information do you have to give to me? Do you have to hand over your phone, for example? And as we know in the US with a different style legal system, that is a lot more challenging. But I think now we'll probably see that firms will insist that you have to hand over the details of your personal accounts. And it's not just LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn's probably just the tip of the iceberg, and it's probably an easy one to surveil. But I think it's the other areas where you have social media, and that does obviously bring into light the risks that you mentioned around political views and personal views, which some people might not find too appetizing. When you're doing the monitoring on this information from a conduct perspective. So I think that's really important, and I think how we tackle that, and we probably have to do it from a sort of unified regulatory perspective globally, is quite interesting as well.
Yeah, unifying the regulators is not going to be straightforward.
No, that's not straightforward, and you don't want to see different regulators moving at different paces either. So.
Yeah, no, that's difficult. Thank you. So I guess I was trying to round us back up to our sort of big overarching question at the beginning. I guess we look to the future, and social media clearly presents a plethora of challenges to the compliance field. Is there something that firms and regulators should look to monitor or safeguard against in the future? I think you mentioned certain channels we need to draw more attention to. Is there the new WhatsApp problem that obviously the regulators have had some significant elements and some predictions around that possibly? And I guess will firms require in-scope employees to give up their social media handles, or should this just be a data retention exercise? Get back to that sort of ban or not ban, or how do we land on that? Hamad, what are you thinking?
Yeah. So I think one of the key things I think that will come out of this is regulators will definitely be clamping down hard on the role of influencers. I think you can see, some of the news, etc., that's coming out, and I think they'll want to make a very hard stand on it as soon as possible. I also feel that I think social media companies should be taking more accountability and ownership because they are technically providing a role or providing a platform for misadvertising, etc., to take place. But you would question that this is what fuels the demand for social media, right? The ability for someone to put something out there and have their say, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. So why would they want to stop that? But I definitely think there needs to be more accountability, and maybe you could see social media firms being fined as well, which might be a change. Very quickly onto something that's slightly different but very similar kind of feeling to social media is the metaverse, right? Which is a virtual reality world. And you can see now companies like IKEA are hiring people to work in their metaverse, and it's providing an opportunity for people to communicate and even trade within that virtual reality world. So how would firms kind of monitor this? And this is very much on the horizon. Do we need an equivalent trade surveillance for metaverse, or would we need that in the future? So I think that's very interesting in terms of future developments also. But going back to your point around, social handles, personal handles, should they be monitored or not? I think it does depend on the appetite of the firm. And my view is that history has shown this, that over time, surveillance has increased exponentially. It hasn't reduced. So I think sooner or later, I think you would see a change in risk appetite for many firms, especially those that are regulated.
Interesting stuff. I think the metaverse is one that I need to get more familiar with.
I think that keeps us in a job, doesn't it? The metaverse.
Well, it makes life very challenging. I think
it does.
in some respects.
And because you're right, I mean, the cost of surveillance is something that I'm sure, this time of year, especially when we're doing budgeting, is definitely high on everyone's agenda, isn't it? And adding in new channels, it becomes more and more of an expense for the firm. But, weighed up against that is you've got the costs and of regulatory fines, sorry. So, seeing this as the next sort of WhatsApp area is probably how firms are viewing it. There's a lot of very sort of nervous CEOs that have just written out checks. So, you've got to take this stuff very seriously, and that's sort of where it's going.
And just expanding a little bit on that, are we looking at more of the conduct rules, the market conduct rules, non-financial misconduct that seems to be the pressing thematic that's happening now? We've talked about consumer duty to a degree. We've talked about advertising and so forth and marketing regulation. Is there a focus? Is it just all-encompassing?
Well, it feels like it's all-encompassing. Yeah. That's the thing. I mean, certainly, as we mentioned, non-financial misconduct in EMEA is really a hot topic at the moment, and that's where a lot of firms are putting a lot of focus now. But yeah, certainly, it feels like it's a growing area.
Okay, thank you both. So we're going to just pause with breath for a moment. We have a little time available, and I should have probably mentioned this at the top of the hour, to have some Q&A. So if you've got some questions, you're able to submit them, and it should be available through the chat functionality that you have that you're watching this through. I have a couple of questions that have already come through, but feel free to continue to submit if you have some. So just picking up back where we were, I think we're saying, and forgive me if I'm summarising this incorrectly or unfairly, but I think we're saying that banning is impossible, and we've just got to get ourselves kind of square with that. Record keeping and surveillance, therefore, is needed. We talked a bit about across the whole population, and I think that's probably going to be a bridge too far, at least in the shorter term. But is that a roughly fair reflection of how we're heading?
Oh, definitely.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind speaking for my views here at all. And obviously, these aren't, in my views, not BNY, but expansion of the population is definitely one of the aspects that's coming in, given the use of AI across the firm and the fact that it could bring more and more people into scope, I think. So that's sort of a natural extension of the population. And then on top of that, you have the extension of platforms and channels as well. And all of a sudden, this thing is becoming exponential. So finding a way to do this effectively remains the challenge without having to employ more and more analysts to review sort of hits and false positives that you need to wade through. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree. So a couple of questions have leaked through, and feel free if you fancy taking one of these on. But the first one, is it best practice for organisations to review any message sent by employees before they're posted? So let's say they're in-scope employees. So we're going to try and limit that not to all employees. So I guess these are going to be your market-facing or your client-facing population that you would usually consider to be in scope. Is that, do you think, going to be the next step?
Is this just social media?
Yeah. I guess in addition to what you're monitoring what they're doing, but there's the social media piece, I guess, is before they're posted for fear that they may breach some regulation.
So I think that happens through organisational accounts anyway. They are monitored before they go out into the public. I think the question then just becomes for personal social media accounts, and even then I think it will be impossible to kind of pre-review anything that someone is sending out on their personal social media, so it will be very much a proactive review. But yes, I mean, if you are operating on behalf of the company, those are all pre-vetted and approved before they go out.
I think that's fair. I'll have another one for you. Is it the panel's view that it is legitimate to monitor business and personal communications in order to ensure compliance with record-keeping policies?
I think we've got to say yes.
Yeah, I think we do, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, it's here to stay. I think we've probably answered that question in terms of to ban or not to ban. I don't think we can ban it. I don't think that's being future or forward looking, and I think we have to sort of embrace what is happening, even though we're probably getting a bit long in the tooth ourselves. We've got to think about the younger generation, Banning it is certainly therefore not plausible, I don't think. So I think yes, absolutely.
Okay. We used to pick up of one of the questions I sort of summarised with, but what's more likely? Is it firms monitoring for market conduct risk, marketing rules, or market compromising content? If we had to pick one, what's the worst of the problems, I guess, is what that's saying.
I think given all the WhatsApp fines, certainly CEOs are probably thinking about the business content, the record keeping requirements around business content. I think hot on the heels of that, though, is this non-financial misconduct, which is increasingly more and more important for all firms now. So I think those two really, as opposed to people's own personal views. So I think it's definitely firms looking to protect themselves, given the recent spate of fines. So yeah, that's sort of my view.
Okay, a couple just to finish this off, I think. For social media posts, for example, on LinkedIn, is it okay to have the disclosures linked, or should they all be visible right there on the main post?
So I think they need to be visible on the post, and I think from 2025, I think for Instagram, anyone posting on Instagram will have to have it disclosed right on the front of the post, and also they'll be asked to actually complete a full disclosure, and if that isn't disclosed, then you're not allowed to post. So I think you will get a lot more transparency, and it has to be as transparent as possible, not hidden away in the T's and C's in font size 2, where probably someone like me can't even read it.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair.
But that's for people that are going to play fair, isn't it? And you're going to have a lot of other platforms that won't adhere to the rules, I guess, or feel that we're outside that regulatory perimeter. So
I think that the requirement a little bit goes to the need for the platforms themselves to be having a hard look at themselves and what they've got to do in order to seek to try and to have some responsibility, particularly in the financial services area, perhaps.
But then you'll probably have someone like Elon Musk who refuses to play by those rules because they say freedom of speech and
Okay, I've got one that I think is a good one to possibly sort of close us out. Do you feel there will be pushback on civil liberties around separation of personal and professional opinions? I mean, that kind of cuts to the nub of the issue in some respects, doesn't it? Anyone fancy tackling that?
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to the point I was making around having clarity for the organisation or the firm in terms of what the expectations are from the colleagues. So, even if, let's say, there is monitoring to be done on personal social media handles, what does that entail? If it is only business related content, then I think you kind of ignore that civil liberties issue, but it ultimately depends on having that clarity up front and to say, look, any business related, this has to be monitored for the firms to protect themselves. So yeah, it's a very challenging question, but again, I think firms need to be clear and bold on their approach. Yeah.
Did you want to add anything?
I think civil liberties are effectively falling by the wayside. In effect, it's all becoming one and the same. I mean, nowadays you have to be, anything that you post is there. That's it. It's there. And I try and say to my kids, you be really careful what you post, because come a job interview in a few years' time, that can come back and haunt you. And you have to be aware that what you consider your own personal view may well be taken as the view of somebody else or a different organisation as you grow in life. So it's really important that people consider that. And unfortunately, it probably does mean an erosion of civil liberties.
And I think the challenge comes, like Darren's saying, is, some people, and I'm not a big social media person, so I wouldn't know, but there are accounts that you can set up with privacy settings, right? Which means your information is not out in the public. So, would that fall in the scope? Or, so again, it's not as simple as a yes or no or a black or white, or it's a real challenging
But
question.
you could probably see in the code of conduct question that we all have to sign each year, have you disclosed all your personal social media handles, for example?
You think that's there? That's coming?
It probably is coming,
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. I think that's a good place to press pause, and I think that we're slightly running for time. So I think really informative session, and it leaves me to say a huge thank you to my panelists, Hamad, Darren. Thank you so very much for a really thought-provoking discussion. There's lots here, isn't there? And I suspect there's going to be plenty of content around this going forward. Finally, I'd just like to say thank you for the audience for tuning in. If you'd like to check out the 2024 Global Relay Industry Insights Compliant Communications Report, which has just been published, or reach out to Global Relay or myself on any of the issues raised today, please visit the website at globalrelay.com, where you can engage directly with us. But for now, thanks again and cheerio.